William Rowe presents and defends an inductive argument from evil. Sometimes this is called the evidential argument from evil. And in part one, we will primarily focus on what the argument is, how Rowe develops it, and then we'll consider one potential response to the argument. But then in part two, we will examine criticisms of the argument and Rowe's responses to those criticisms. So the context of the argument, the inductive argument, Rowe notes that although he is an atheist, he states up front that it's unlikely that any logical argument from evil will succeed. In other words, he agrees with the theist that it looks like it's logically possible that you could have God exist and evil exist, that just because there is evil, that does not rule out the existence of God. And the logical argument from evil says if there's any evil whatsoever, then God does not exist. And Rowe does not accept that argument, which is why he goes on to the second type of argument from evil, the inductive or the evidential argument from evil. And what he says then is that there is an argument for atheism that may rationally justify someone in being an atheist. It gives you a rational basis for being an atheist. Even if evil and God are consistent, logically speaking, when you consider certain types of evil, it gives you reason to think that God does not exist. So there's a broad sense of theist that Rowe considers. This would be someone who believes in the existence of some sort of divine being. So many people are theists in that way. And that's not really his concern here. You don't really have an argument from evil that is a problem for many versions of some sorts of divine being. The concern is more focused in on what he calls a narrow sense of a theist, and that's someone who believes the existence of God as traditionally conceived, who has the characteristics of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, especially the two, being all powerful and being all good, and then you add omniscience in there as well to make the argument work. So this is certainly a view of God that most traditional theists hold. Not that that is all the characteristics of God, but that God does have those characteristics. Okay, so what's the argument? Let's get right to it. Rowe says there exists instances of intense suffering, which an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being, and we'll just refer to this being as God, could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So there is in the world these cases where there is intense suffering and there's no purpose for it, right? It doesn't bring about a greater good, and it doesn't prevent something that would be even worse. But God would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering. It could, unless God could not do so without losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. In other words, God would have a purpose for the existence of any evil that there would exist in the world. But one says there are some intense suffering, some evil that doesn't have a purpose. And we put these two premises together as stated, and we conclude that God does not exist. So this gives us a reason to think that God does not exist. Now, as stated, it's not quite a valid deductive argument, but that's okay. Rowe is not worried about presenting a valid deductive argument. He's presenting an inductive argument, an evidential argument, providing reasons to think that the conclusion is true. Okay, let's look at support for premise 2. So we're examining what circumstances there would be that would permit rationally and morally God to allow an instance of evil. So when would that be? What cases would that be? And Rowe identifies three of these cases. First of all, if there's a greater good, G, such that G, this greater good, is obtainable by God only if God permits E, some evil. So this would be similar to a child learning to walk and then falling down and getting hurt. But it's a greater good to learn to walk. It's worth the slight pain that a toddler might experience. Or it might be plausible for God to allow evil when there is some greater good, G, such that G is obtainable by God only if God permits either E or some evil equally bad or worse. So this is similar to A, but it's saying, maybe you could avoid the evil considered in A, but only by allowing some other evil that's very comparable. Setting a fracture would be like this. You have a broken bone in pain. Setting the fracture causes even more pain, but it's worth it because you need to get the bone to heal properly. And then finally, when it might be plausible is when there is an evil such that it is preventable by God, but only if God permits some evil equally bad or worse. And so this would be comparable to, say, a parent getting their child immunized by an injection, and the injection hurts, it causes pain, but the pain is not greater than what might be the case if the child got the disease that the immunization was for. All right, so that might give you some reasons, but if there are no other cases besides A, B, and C that we've just described, when it would be permissible for God to allow evil, then premise 2 is true. And Rowe says, furthermore, both theists and atheists alike would agree with premise 2. They both think premise 2 is true. Now, in fact, there is a vigorous debate among theists whether or not that premise is true. Some theists argue that God could be justified in allowing certain evils, even if they don't produce greater good or prevent worse evils from happening. And that's a different discussion, so we're going to bypass that. I just wanted to note that there is actually quite a bit of a debate in many theists who actually don't accept premise 2. However, there certainly are theists who do accept premise 2. And so let's continue. So that would mean that the issue is whether premise 1 is true. If a theist is going to avoid the conclusion of the argument that God does not exist, that it's at least rationally to believe that God does not exist, they have to address premise 1, assuming they're accepting the second premise. So, are there actually cases of suffering like were described in premise 1? Purposeless suffering, suffering without providing an opportunity for greater good or preventing worse evil. And Rowe argues that yes, there are. And he tells a story that's been often repeated about a fawn that is somehow caught up in a forest fire and is badly burned, but doesn't die right away. And then after a few days of intense suffering, it dies. And so this seems like one of those cases, right? It seems like God could have prevented the suffering, and it certainly seems that there's no greater good that will occur due to the suffering, right? It doesn't look like it's preventing a worse evil that might have occurred. So this looks like a certainly reason to think that premise 1 is true. And all you need is one case. Now, Rowe doesn't say that this actually happened, but certainly given what we know about the world, we have reason to think something like this actually has happened. And so this gives Rowe reason to accept premise 1. Now, Rowe acknowledges that we might be unaware of a greater good or some mitigating circumstances that would rule out the fawn situation falling into a type A case, being one of those cases that is not producing a greater good, even though is this intense suffering. And it's certainly, it's possible that we're not aware of how it might rule, fit into situations B or C, that so that it doesn't fit the situation. Maybe there is a greater purpose. We're just unknown. It's unknown to us what that purpose is. So Rowe says, look, we can't prove that one is true because of our limited capacities of understanding, but he says it's altogether reasonable to believe that one is true. Now, I think this is interesting here. If you have looked at Rowe's cosmological argument and his criticism for that, he rejects an initial version of the argument, and his reason for rejecting it is you can't prove one of the premises is true. It may seem plausible and reasonable to accept it, but you can't prove it, so you should reject the argument. Here, he's not doing that, right? Here, he's saying we can't prove it's true, but it's altogether reasonable to believe that one is true. Now, I think this is a plausible approach. I'm not criticizing Rowe for taking this approach. I actually did criticize him for taking the approach he did when discussing the cosmological argument. Okay, now that's the argument. We have the argument. We have the support for premise one. We have the statement that it looks like most people accept premise two. I want to consider one possible response, and this is what Rowe calls the direct attack. That is, attempting directly to reject premise one, to say that premise one is false. How? By identifying goods that might be connected with suffering that has occurred. Now, these would be second-order goods in the context of the logical problem of evil, but we need not explore that. So how would you do a direct attack? Well, if this was a human suffering, proponents of the virtue defense might say that this allows for virtues to develop, and that's a good thing. People have to be in danger, for example, for someone to be courageous. People have to be in need for someone to be generous, and so on. So that might work. Or the free will defense, it's good to not to limit human freedom. So we allow humans to do what they want to do, and sometimes humans cause evil. But here, those ideas don't seem to apply, right? Because we're talking about a fawn suffering. So fawns don't develop virtues, and fawns don't have free will of the kind that we're concerned about when we're talking about the argument from evil. And so you have to be able to say something about that particular case that Rowe described. Now, what possibility is there? Well, okay, you could stretch it, you could describe it, maybe say, well, there were starving vultures, and but they weren't close enough to the fire because they had to flee the fire, and they were starving, so they had a hard time getting back to the fawn. And of course, they only eat animals that are already dead, so they needed the animal to be dead. But yet, in this picture here, we have at least a half a dozen vultures who are now eating and feasting and not going to suffer by starvation. And so maybe there was this greater purpose in the fawn getting burned. Yeah, okay, maybe that's a direct attack. Maybe that gives you reason to question premise one. But note that you would have to do that for every single kind of story. You would have to come up with some other story about why it's justifiable for God to permit that evil. That's a challenge. But in any case, let's go on to look at other criticisms of the argument and how Rowe responds. But we do that in part 2 of the video. So we need to go to part 2.